Hi, everybody. A lot of bass right there. Welcome back from your break. Some of you might be wondering about lunch. It's going to get brought up here at 12:45, and you can eat, on the terrace or anywhere else. So that's happening. I want to know how many of you are trying to build new things right now. You get a show of hands. A lot of people. I knew that. I knew the big answer. Of course, when you're trying to build new things, you have to think about how to be more creative, and you have to think about how to just discover and explore. And you heard all that talk from Kevin about iteration, and there was so much almost like wasted effort, except you didn't feel like it was wasted. And the next session is all about that. This tension between we have to produce something new, we have to be productive, but we also have to be creative, and we have to find ways to solve new problems. It turns out this is, a struggle for both design and development. So we put together a panel with Figma's VP of Design, Noah Levin, VP of Engineering from GitHub, Neha Batra, and the head of design from GitHub, Diana Mounter. They've done things like GitHub, obviously, Copilot. GitHub definitely did that. Copilot, obviously, pull requests, all the things that your developers are probably using. So please join me in welcoming Noah, Neha, and Diana to the stage.
Hello. Good afternoon, morning. It's good to see you all. Thanks for coming. This is a super exciting opportunity to have both Neha and Diana here. And we're going to chat a bunch about creativity, design, development, all kinds of interesting things. And to get things started, I thought it would be fun to, we're all kind of probably leaders or managers or whatever in this room. And probably all of us have our origin stories or the early moments where we realized we were managers, the moment that something changed or whatever that might be. And so to kick us off, the first question I'm going to ask here is is there a memorable moment where you just realized you were a manager all of a sudden? Why don't we start with Diana and then really after?
Yeah, I don't think you wake up one day and feel like, oh yeah, I'm a manager now. But there are moments where I'm like, oh shit, I'm a manager. And I think those moments have been when I found myself using spreadsheets more than Figma, and finding myself in more meetings and things like that than creating design. So I think it's realizing that the way that you can be productive changes, and getting used to that. And I think it's a gradual process of adapting to that. And then, you find yourself having conversations with friends and saying things like, so what you need to do is you need to model, coach, and care. Like things like that. So, yeah.
What about you, Neha?
Yeah, for me, I got an opportunity to move from an IC to a manager role pretty quickly at GitHub, and I still wanted to stay close to the code, and so I was still reviewing PRs, pull requests, and I went to one of my team meetings. So it was like me and other engineering managers with our director in our team sync, and I was like, I'm so behind on work. I still haven't reviewed any PRs this week. And they're like, oh yeah, that must be so hard for you. And I was like, wait a minute, is anyone else reviewing PRs here? And they're like, oh no, we're not doing that. And I'm like, you know what? Why am I doing it then? Why didn't anyone tell me? And so I started to realize that, and we had a really good conversation between me and my manager about what it really means to enable teams and what are all the things that need to get done before I can dive into the code. And that list, I was like, oh, that's going to take up my time full time for sure. Because there's no one else who's doing those things. And so that was my moment where I was like, all right, I'm officially putting the code away. No one let me hear it. And so I'm officially in management.
I feel like there's a fun, maybe we'll get to it later, but like an interesting moment of how hands-on should we be as managers, and what's sort of the line between being involved in pull requests or in Figma files and when not to, and all that. But we're going to have basically these, as you can see up here, these like 3 kind of guiding topics for us that we're going to get right into, and hopefully that was a helpful warm up. And the first topic, for example, is around how we handle ambiguity. Obviously in design and engineering, there's a lot that can come up that's unexpected, and it can be tricky to plan for. The second topic we'll get into is a bit about productivity and what that sort of means, and how do you define it? How do you quantify the output of what we do? Do we have to do that? What is that like? That's going to be kind of the meat of the discussion. And then the third topic you'll see is a bit about, given that we're here representing Figma and GitHub, we make the tools that hopefully many of you are using to build products. And so what does that mean for how we work? And so we're just going to jump right into that first section around planning around ambiguity. And even if it doesn't go, it doesn't matter. The slides aren't that important. They just have the title so that you know what we're talking about. There we go. Beautiful. So this first topic is kind of about, this is an abstract image of a double diamond. I'm sure it's a familiar metaphor to the process that many of you have heard. And this first diamond on the left represents kind of like the early stages of a design project, where I find that it's kind of hard to predict how long it's going to take. People might ask that, or you might have deadlines coming up and you're really trying to think about it. But design can be it can take time. Surprises can show up. You can pivot. So that can be kind of a challenging process, and it may not always lend itself to clarity. So the first question in this topic is sort of, how do you help your teams get comfortable with the ambiguity that can show up in the early stages of a project? Like, are there things you felt you've had to do to either adjust expectations or make space for creative ideas? Whatever comes to mind.
You want to start? Or you want me to go?
Okay.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I think there's a few ways to think about working through ambiguity and creating understanding around that. So when I think about my direct team, my design team, for designers, I think it's about creating constraints and leaning on your design thinking skills, and creating the right constraints. So if you are working on something that is an iteration, a small iteration on an existing feature, then you're going to have the constraints of that UI. Ideally, you have things like data and user insights, and you have business goals, and that's a smaller square for you to work in. When it's something more ambiguous, like a new product or feature, and we need some blue sky thinking, then I think the types of constraints that you create for yourself will be quite different. So you don't want to narrow that too much, but you can use techniques like design sprints or activities like Super 8s to do sort of fast iteration, brainstorming, that type of thing. And I think that helps people move from that blank canvas into a solution. So I think very much like getting that level of constraints right is really important. And then I think also about helping the other teams that we work with understand more about the creative process. I think that's a bit challenging sometimes. So helping engineering or product realize that we're not going to get the best out of the designer if we create too much of a narrow space for them in which to work with, if it's something that really needs bigger thinking. Mm-hmm. And that's challenging and something that I think we have to constantly work on.
Yeah, I think that I was just thinking about it earlier today, but like I think on both the engineering side and on the design side, we kind of detest deadlines, period, right? And we don't want them, right? And so people say, when is it going to get done? And you're like, it'll get done when it gets done, right? And that's not very helpful for a business and for us to like manage expectations with our stakeholders. And so I think to kind of build on what Diana was saying, everyone needs a point of stability, right? And so if you want to be able to create, enable a creative process and enable creative in some certain places, then you need to provide stability in other ways, right? And so what are the ways that we can provide stability? Is it like having a regular check-in in the morning, right? And like a stand-up or a team meeting at the beginning of the week. And it doesn't mean that you have to accomplish the work that you need to accomplish, but you have to provide something around team norms, around expectations, so that if those things are fixed, then the other things can be variable. And so I think that's like very important for me is like, okay, cool. What am I trying to enable and what's scary about that? And if that's going to be the place where people are spending their scary points, like how can I create some safe points for them? And like, there's like this really great research done by Paloma Medina on core needs. So she has this acronym BICEPS. And so it's like every person has a core need. And so that might be S is for stability, right? It's an acronym. And some people are going to want to go really fast. Some people are going to want to like be focused on equality and fairness about like how we're being treated versus others. And other people are going to want stability. Everyone wants different things. And so you have to provide that creativity and velocity on one side and then stability on the other. And then I think that ultimately, if we cannot be like, there are certain problems that we just don't know where we're going yet. And so if we don't know where we're going to go and we don't know when we're going to be done, we can at least have some certain gates around like, okay, cool. The goal of this experiment or this round is to like get an answer for this, right? And like either we're gonna, let's give it 2 weeks. Let's see where we're at. And we might need to extend more time because we're not there yet. But we should still be having the conversation. I feel like people are very like uncomfortable around dates, but as long as we can be clear at the beginning about, hey, we don't need to have the answer, but we need to at least have a conversation about where we're headed, right?
Yeah. I like the idea of setting up gates that have like, they're just trying to answer a question. Like there's something interesting about, you could just set a deadline and say, we just have to be done by now, but instead being like, do we understand this better now at this moment?
Exactly, right?
Yeah. Do you, kind of thinking about actually earlier when you were talking about just the, being hands-on or not hands-on, when you think about this here, like can either of you think of a moment or a time where you had to step in to create that question or that clarity or that, if the team was stuck and they needed you, like how involved are you in some of those? Like, is it all kinds of projects, just some, like how do you help come in these early phases, or is it pretty hands-off for the early parts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different, right? I think as a leader, you have to work at different altitudes sometimes, and you need to sort of know where to go, how low to go, or who you're working with. And I think that, for me as a design leader, I still need to lean on my experience as a designer, on my design skills sometimes. So sometimes that, might mean I'm helping pitch a new direction. If I'm seeing something that is really, I think, maybe we've come up with a goal and a headline, and we're like just running to that, and the team is like, this actually, as we're digging into it, so I'm unraveling a lot of problems, and this feels like a band-aid solution. And so that's when I might step in. It depends who I'm working with, right? Like if the team are in a position to also sort of pitch a new direction, I might lean on my design skills and experience and help the team see a broader vision, use my storytelling skills to help shift the direction. I think it's also important to build layers of trust, and also to find a balance between protecting your team and letting them learn and feel some of the challenges, right? So I love it when
it's not hard.
Yeah. It's a difficult balance, right?
Yeah.
But if you ideally you want those problems solved at the team level, so whether that's ICs or managers or whatever, and it's good if they can come to find that solution together. But sometimes, things get more difficult, and that needs to be escalated to that next layer. So sometimes I'm just coaching that director or about how they might move forward with this with their team. Because ideally, I don't want to step in with the hammer and be like, how the design thinks this, right? You don't really want, that's my head of design voice. You don't really want it to get to that. But just like anyone, I lean on my skills that I've built up as an IC designer as well sometimes.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. For me, I was super involved as an engineering manager, obviously, because like that's my job, is to like be able to help figure out the charter of how we're going to get something done. And as a director, I had to shift up to teaching my managers on like what the right processes are that we could like use in their toolbox. And so like, for example, what does a good kickoff look like? And like, what kind of questions could we identify up front in order for us to be able to like have a smoother ride down the line? What does it mean to have a good relationship with your engineer or your design and your product counterparts? And now, and that was true when I was a senior director. Now that I'm a VP, I kind of missed it sometimes. Like there's something so exhilarating about being part of a project and trying to like be in the middle of it and figure out how to unblock things. Now my job is to create the processes, to help the people create the processes, to help the people create the processes. But like, I think one thing to build on what Diana said is that like, as a leader, I have a lot of power. So if, for example, there's like a lot of nervousness around a deadline, right? Me coming in and being like, you were relieved of this like stress and like, I will help cover for you. Here are the stakeholders that you need to inform and here's how you want to do it, right? Like my voice carries weight. My voice also carries weight if I start getting rabbit holed by a really cool project. Like there might be something that I'm really interested in, but if I say, oh, you should take a look at this, that might completely change the direction of a project. And like, I didn't mean it, right? I just like wanted to ideate with you all. And so I have to be really conscious of that power and like how I can use that for good or how that might actually have unanticipated after effects that won't be visible to me until like 3 months later. Where I'm like, hey, what happened to this? And they're like, well, you said that we should take a look at the profile page. I'm like, yeah, it's just like an idea. And they're like, well, we have all this work behind it. So I just have to be really conscious of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The idea that, I liked your term, like kind of shift up at a different point in your career when you're managing a larger team where you being involved in that earlier stage can really shift something quickly and make an adjustment that may not have been needed at that time or they take it the wrong way. Just to get a sense of who's in the room a little bit, just going to ask a quick like hand-raising questions. How many of you are responsible for managing managers in some way? Just like,
oh, wow.
All
right.
That's helpful context because I feel like that you could probably relate to what both of just said there.
Yeah.
And then also because my next question is going to be about design and engineering. How many of you are engineering leaders? I don't expect many here maybe because of the nature of a design conference, but it's helpful.
Dozens of them.
Right. There. Good. So this question might, kind of relate regardless if that's your role or not. But, in these early stages, there's this question often of like, when do you involve engineering in early processes? And, especially if it's a 0 to 1 kind of project, it can be hard to have like a team of 10 or 20 engineers ready on day one when we don't know what it is yet that we're making.
Yeah.
So how do you involve engineers in those early projects or what, how does that work?
Yeah, Diana, how do you?
I thought you were going to say that. Oh, seriously. Okay.
Yeah, stuff your engineers.
All right, I'll come in after.
Yeah, I mean, I think bringing people along with the journey is really important, and I love some of my favorite memories working when I wasn't more in spreadsheets and stuff, but like when we've had all the different disciplines in the room, we've got engineering, design, research, product management, maybe marketing, and we're working together through what's really important about the goals of the thing that we're working through. We've got early ideas and sort of bringing their insights in. I think it's really important to bring the team along. I think each function brings different perspectives and will likely think of something that you have not. It will also help them start thinking about how they might solve some of the problems as when it gets more into their hands. Mm-hmm. I think it builds motivation because they feel more of an investment because they've been more involved and feel like even if it's just been post-it note brainstorming exercise or clicking through Figma and leaving a comment, they feel like they're being heard and their views are valued. So I think it's really important to bring the team along. There are, quite a few different ways that we might do that within our at GitHub. Each team, works a little differently. There's things that are hard rules that we work towards, and then how the day-to-day goes is going to be a little bit different. But we've had, on some teams we do if it's on design systems, component reviews and walk through the API of that component with engineers and sort of weed out the issues. we do bigger things like demo days sometimes, because we're a big sort of demos, not memos.
Yeah,
kind of a
big one.
Demo's not memo.
Yeah. I don't think we invented that. Like, anyway. And then, I think we do something that's become very popular at GitHub is Passion Weeks. And we've committed to that in design, and many engineering product teams have too. And so sometimes we do them, just within a design team. And then sometimes we do it within the engineering and product and design team together. And I think that's even if it might not be working on something that has to ship, I think it just builds empathy. Sometimes amazing ideas like come out of that turn into something that ships or influence a way of working. So whether it's a thing that is like on the roadmap, or it's something like fun in a passion week, I think just merging each other's, like blending each other's worlds is a good thing to do, because it just sort of
is a passion week sort of like it's like a hack week. It's a short period of time for coming up with new ideas and moving them forward. That's
it's like a hackathon. But I think like hackathon, you might think you have to like create something brand new, but there could just be like a bug that you're really passionate about, or there's just like a tool that you really want to improve. And so we use the term pretty interchangeably at GitHub. So some people call them hackathons and some people call them passion weeks. Mm-hmm. There's like a different connotation. So I think like you can kind of see when people err towards passion weeks, they're really talking about, they can see from the team that they've like been wanting to work on something outside of their area, and they like are particularly passionate about it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a fun example of how like in those early stages, in that moment, you have a week. So it's just everything kind of feels like it has to be clearer, faster. And getting engineering and design working together in those moments feels very like almost organic and helpful when you're just kind of working in that state. I'm going to move us to the next topic, actually. So I want to get to the heart of the kind of title that brought us here together, which is really about like this nuance of measuring productivity. It's kind of this uncomfortable thing I think some of us are sometimes asked to do, right? As leaders in this room, you might be asked like to quantify, hey, how productive is your team, or what's the output like, or how do we know? And in engineering, as you can see in the chart, sometimes, and it's not really just measured on this, of course, but there's some mechanics you can use. You could at least measure the amount of, pull requests as like a chart like this shows. In design, like I guess you could have something like how many mock-ups you've made or prototypes you've made, but that's obviously not really like the end goal. And so there's this question that shows up sometimes where we're struggling to figure out, how do we define if someone is healthy and productive? Is their output okay? And so I guess maybe the first question is, how do you have to do that? Like, are you asked to measure the productivity of your teams? Does this come up at all for you? And what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think it's a real hot topic right now, especially with AI, right? You're trying to decide tools that are promising productivity. How do you measure that, right? And so obviously you need a baseline, and all of a sudden we're being asked to measure productivity in our team, and it's very uncomfortable. At GitHub, especially on the engineering side, sure, we have the commit graph, which like measures contributions. We do not actively use it. In fact, I don't look at any metrics with respect to my teams, right? I have 340 ICs. I have like 11 departments, 32 teams, right? So I do not look at any metric on a week by week. Like I look at our OKRs. Mm-hmm. So like essentially, monthly active users, monthly engaged users, and things like that for a product. But that's not going to help me understand whether a team has like productivity. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why I don't look at that is, number one, I don't think that velocity is a good indicator for productivity. Mm-hmm. In fact, I care more about volatility than I care about velocity, and volatility is a change between velocity week by week. Mm-hmm. So instead of looking at maximizing my velocity, I want to make sure that we have consistent weeks, week over week. So what can I do to provide that like consistent way where if volatility is as minimal as possible, we have predictability around timelines, we have predictability around what we can accomplish. I have the ability to kind of know what I can move around in order to improve it. I don't actively look at it. And honestly, even at GitHub, right, which has all the metrics and can allow you to quantify things, I would say that the best way for me to understand who's being productive is a vibe. It's a vibe, right? And there are definitely teams that you can look at and say, hey, these teams are being more productive than others. And often we actually ask them to say, hey, what are you doing differently than you did before, because things feel differently this quarter. And we want them to share it with each other. Instead of me defining a metric and then going top down, I want to look at the bright spots in my organization, and I want to be able to derive, okay, cool, is this applicable or not? And what I'm finding is that like, once you, I mean, we have different kinds of code bases. Some are very legacy code bases. Some are very brand new and fresh. You're going to see different kinds of metrics for what is productivity there. So like, I can't implement one across all of my teams. And I think that's like a very controversial stance, honestly, right now. People are really looking for more metrics, and we are trying to understand where our bright spots are and how to increase that. But it's kind of vibes right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that vibe check. Like, it's a good point that at sort of the executive level, at the leadership level, you're definitely not quantifying like individual output and performance.
No.
It's a good point that you're looking at team health. And team health, I guess one question is that just engineering team health? Is that actually like the product design engineering as a whole? Like, do both of you talk together about the health of an area sometimes? Like, yeah, how do you vibe check a team?
Yeah, I mean, so Neha might sometimes be more often working with one of my directs, who sort of owns the area. So I know that each sort of EPD, engineering product design squad, has leaders that connect regularly. And yeah, part of that is like, part of team health is like, do we have the right resources with the right skills, like working on this? So that's definitely a frequent part of reporting upwards, as well as is that sort of team health check. There's also is the communication flow working, and so that's often something that is worked on at the sort of EPD team level. Because I lead all of design, of course I have like directors working in with Neha, with I think probably 2 or 3 at this point. Yeah. Because Neha is quite a big area, but yeah, it's like all of the areas. So I'm not necessarily going to be in having those conversations directly, but my directs do. As a design leader, though, I also we do like quarterly leadership meetups, sometimes in person, sometimes remote. And part of that activity is to talk about team health as well, so that I can get visibility and know what within my org I can do and where I need to work with other teams to improve that team health.
Yeah. What do we think? Like, when you say health, is it like they're not shipping, or it's taking too long to ship, or there's like conflicts deeply embedded in the teams? Like, what are some examples that come to mind of like, when you're debugging that? Yeah.
Like, I think an indicator for sure is like missed deadlines or repeated missed deadlines. That's like not that is the lead to a story. So if I see certain teams who have like missed deadlines repeatedly, I like want to dig into it and understand what's going on, and like to kind of reinforce. So I'm like one of many engineering VPs, and so I've got counterparts. And so if Diana and I have regulars, but if I'm bringing something up to her, it means I couldn't solve it amongst all the layers up until then. So then things are like really going off the rails, which actually really happens. We can usually resolve it at lower levels, but missed deadlines, I think, is one of the biggest indicators for us to like figure out what the story is.
And then what do you feel like you have to do when that happens as a leader? Like, do you mix up the teams ever? Does that I mean, that's probably a big solution, but sometimes there are probably other things. Like, when you're debugging that and it doesn't, what happens?
Well, I mean, everyone wants to point fingers at each other to figure out what the truth is, right?
Truth seekers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love things like blameless postmortems, which we obviously stole from.
Blameless postmortems? Yeah, what's that? Yeah.
I actually learned this at Etsy, and it's something that I've seen like done at GitHub as well. Some people might call it different names, but essentially it's about focusing on the steps that led to a problem. Now, this might be done when there's like a major incident, but it's also a useful practice when something just did not like work out in quite the right way. So as an example, we might have shipped like a new feature page that's really like a flagship page, and we're leading up to that. We're like a couple of weeks away perhaps, and we figure out like that we're not really sure what the hero should be because we haven't figured out with product and engineering what like features and code examples to show. That could be an example. And so we've got just enough time to like hit that deadline, but that's not the way that we want it to happen, because then you've got like pressure on that team for the last 2 weeks. So to me, that's a great situation. Like it's not just about when something goes wrong, like in the sense of the site goes down or a deadline was missed, but that there was unnecessary pressure and friction in the team. Even though they could, sometimes people still hit that deadline, but getting there was at a cost. And so I think it's really important to look at those situations and track back. And so I don't think I fully explained the postmortem, but it's to step through each of the events that arrived at the crux of that problem and try and unravel how things got there and how it could be avoided in the future. And it's less about, you're in trouble because you did this thing. Yeah. I mean, there's very rare cases where it's like one person did something really awful. Like hopefully you never have that happen. It's usually a mix of like misunderstandings. Someone thought that they listened to Neha saying, "I want this thing."
Right. With but no blame. So how about
you're fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about. I think you've got to create some safety in making mistakes, right? Otherwise, you never learn. Your team isn't going to be upfront about when things didn't go well, and so then you can't learn and fix them.
And if we, especially on the engineering side, it can feel very scary to enter a postmortem. And so the blameless piece, one really great way for us to enable people to think in a more blameless way is reminding people that the system and the technology should support them in preventing these things to happen. So it's like, obviously, for any problem, there's a solution around people, process, or product. And so helping, sometimes what I like to do, I don't do hands-on postmortems that often anymore, but when I did, we would list out a bunch of the problems and talk through how you could solve it through people like training or like asking, changing things up through our process to make sure that the process catches the problem, or through our tools, right? And if we have better tools or better product, then like we can also catch it. And so it helps people kind of step out of that blame and more into like, oh yeah, you're right. You know what? That information should be readily available to me. Like it's not my fault, right? And so like it helps people feel a little bit more comfortable talking about the actual problems that we have.
Yeah, that's a great reminder that during the retro, or even before it, kind of reminding people, we really want to know about the process, the product issues, people issues we can sort out in other ways or whatever if there are communication challenges, but like removing the blame seems helpful. Let's flip it now, actually. So, as leaders in the room, we're often debugging problems. Probably most of our job is doing that. We'd probably spend less time actually like poking at the things that are going really well. And so let's actually look at that for a second. Like when you think about peak productivity in the creative process or otherwise, or, whether that's like a team, the whole organization, an individual, like the things that are just going really smoothly. Obviously, as leaders, we probably don't have to look at them as much, but sometimes it's actually interesting to inspect why, like what went well. So are there either moments or teams that come to mind when you're like, that chapter of GitHub or that couple of months there, like people were really in flow together, and like they just anything that comes to mind where you were like, that team was really off in the groove and we want to replicate that. We need to figure out how.
Yeah, I think some of the moments that pop to mind, probably the most recent one that pops to mind is when we launched what we call Copilot X, that has now evolved into our fuller like Copilot offering and Copilot workspace. I think there were good things and not so good things. Like we talked about the pressure just now, and maybe things could have been more smooth. But the good things about that I think created that environment that I've seen happen, this feel of tributes to other situations like that, is when you are rallied around like the same goal. And I think people get a lot out of like making a success happen, making a ship happen together, and it going off with success because you managed to cut through the annoying stuff or the politics or whatever, and got to like, what do we really need to make happen for this to be successful and get that over the line. And I think things like we have a concept called DRIs, and directly responsible individuals. Like I'm sure lots of other companies do too. And so it can sometimes be that DRI that's just they need that name, but like someone that is like leading and bringing the team together, and people rallying around that, getting.
And so it's Copilot. You mentioned that was like a really memorably like successful one for the team. Or like they were what contributed to that? So it sounds like one thing was goals, having a shared clear goal in mind that like really rallied and brought them together so they weren't going in different directions. That makes a ton of sense. Is there other qualities? Yeah.
So to build on what Diana said, a really good DRI. So like that directly responsible individual, they should be someone who everyone trusts to ultimately make a decision in tiebreak or to essentially unblock us and help us go a little bit faster. They should be someone who has like really good relationships across the board with respect to our stakeholders. And there's someone who will pull from different areas and not just like lead with their taste. Like it's important to have tastemakers and people who have good judgment, but also they know like when to pull in the information. And I've also been really obsessed with looking at like what makes a really good team at GitHub and like what's been successful in the past. And so other things that I've identified are that we start small on the engineering side. So while we're figuring out our proof of concepts and design is taking the lead, right? We want to slow roll our engineers. If a bunch of engineers show up overnight and knock on the door and say like, okay, cool, here's your 6 engineers, let's get started. Like it's very hard for us to do that. And so we want to trickle them in, start with 1 or 2, make sure that relationship is really sound, and then bring more engineers in over time. And then I think having a little bit of like the right go, no-go gates. And so sometimes we'll even set like ahead of time, okay, cool, let's have a go, no-go conversation in 3 months and see like where we're at and where we want to proceed based on like what we've been able to uncover.
Yeah, I think just one more thing to add. I think there's often those moments that are successful are due to a lot of pre-work that's happened, like Neha was saying, with like building trust. So I think that amounts to a lot, and it's worth working on those relationships because you don't know when you're going to need to lean on them.
And then one more too is that if you have like an EPD, engineering product and design lead, I've noticed that for the most successful and like exciting teams, they've had blended roles. So like people are a little bit okay to go outside of like the engineering box or the design box or the product box. And so especially for those 3 leads, right? Being a little bit more about like what do the strengths do the 3 of us bring to the table, and like how can we ensure that overall our product is moving forward without staying in our very clear defined boxes. I found that that's been a very big indicator for what have been made successful teams.
That is like a perfect segue actually, in that this last category is about how we intersect in design and engineering and how we move in it fluidly between each other's tools, or if we even do it. So, we both represent these big, hopefully helpful tools in your process. And then on the design side, we're using Figma. We introduced dev mode so developers come in. But similarly in GitHub, some of the most successful teams I've seen have designs in the pull requests, or actually going in and like looking not always at the code, but at the sort of end result in a preview staging environment, and giving feedback. And sort of, so there's something to what you're saying around like when you're spending time in each other's spaces, and it feels less like you're literally like going across the hall and knocking on a door, and more that you're just fluidly making this product. So this topic is really about like should there be a boundary? Is it okay to go into GitHub as a designer? Is it okay to go into Figma and dev mode as a developer? Like what comes to mind when you think about that?
Yeah, I started at GitHub as an IC, so
individual contributor.
Sorry, yes, and had to, I was a designer that we attract a lot of designers that code, and when I started, that was definitely a requirement. And I think that's something that is helpful for designers to learn from working in GitHub, whether they're shipping production code or not, is that when you put up a pull request, you've kind of invited everyone in to like give feedback, and it's anyone in the engineering or design can go and mosey along if they want to go and find it and give feedback. So I think that's a little scary, right? But I think it's a really good skill for a designer to pick up, because we have to get feedback on our designs all the time, because people can look at it and see it and say stuff about it. And so I think like it just helps deepen that skill in separating your ego a bit, helping you focus on the customer and what it is and the business goals, and valuing the role of feedback in that process. I think that made it pretty easy and comfortable for us as a company, and the right transition to introduce Figma, because it felt like we now had a design tool that worked more like how we were used to working as designers at GitHub, because GitHub is where its foundations are, it's a collaboration tool, right? So obviously got a lot more cool stuff now like Copilot, but that's like the foundations. And Figma suddenly allowed us to like send a URL and have all our design friends jump in just like a pull request.
With me.
And so I think it kind of felt like this, did they design this for GitHub designers, And I think it really helps to just, be able to let go of that ego, value the role of feedback. And I think it makes us a bit of a nerdy design team that embraces some of the engineering practices in our work. And hopefully, I think it helps us blur our worlds a bit. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it does too. I mean, in the open source world, like PRs are open to everyone. And so even at GitHub, we have just to kind of emphasize that one of the points that Diana was making, we have our GitHub organization. Almost all of those repos are open to anyone. So there's more, you could literally go and comment on anyone's PR. You don't, because like maybe you have a day job and you should, like you have other things that you need to do, right? But like you can provide help at any point. You can see anyone's code at any point. And so, especially on the engineering side, you open up a PR, you're opening up to the world of GitHub, right? And like with design being able to do that alongside us, I think it helps empathize with what that journey looks like and how that can be scary and vulnerable, and like allows us to design for better. And then on the engineering side, right, like we're jumping into Figma as well, and we're trying to blend that, because since GitHub is a developer tool, right, obviously we have a lot of engineers who are really passionate about that customer, and they see themselves a little bit in that, which sometimes it makes sense, sometimes they're not the target user. And so we have to help them understand that you can't also be a designer and a product manager. There's like real skills that like people hone and practice on a day-to-day basis. But it is very flexy in that sense, right? Where we're all, we have on the engineering side really passionate people who like want to help define what the product could be, help on the design side, and might have ideas on how to do it, but not necessarily know how to.
Yeah, I love that kind of fluid nature, and I hope that more companies are able to start doing that, where you've got people just less thinking about what each other's roles or titles are, and more just, we're trying to make something. We have this shared idea, and we want to just get through and talk about it and not overly like separate ourselves into different places. I have time for one more question. So, when thinking about what makes working at GitHub unique, or, working with this tool that other people are using, but you're using it probably in your own ways. Yeah. For example, at Figma, we use like FigJam for everything for all of our meetings. And that's, and earlier you mentioned like demos, not memos, is one thing that might be common. Like are there any just either anecdotes or like ways that you either use GitHub or a way that your process might be different from those in the room, but might spark ideas for others in terms of the way they either use their own tools for their process or otherwise? Yeah, just some unique process at GitHub that comes to mind where you're using that tool in your own way or something internally, or...
Yeah. You got an idea?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I think, I honestly do think demos, not memos, is a really cool one. I don't think it's unique, but I think it has become part of GitHub's culture because we have been distributed in a remote company from the start. We do have offices, but we've always had people across the world, and so I think that gravitated us towards the sort of demos, not memos nature, because we have a lot of async communication, and being able to sort of show either whether it's in code and a working prototype, or now like a Figma prototype, or making a little screen recording and then talking to people through it, that can create a lot more clarity than pile of text sometimes. So I think that's why we are a bit demos, not memos. I think the other thing that is really exciting, and one of the reasons that I, love looking at GitHub and also take it pretty seriously at times as well, even though I'm laughing, is because we know with our work that we have the ability to solve problems for ourselves because we use GitHub to build GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we find the right solution, that could make a big difference. Sometimes it's just a tiny design detail, and that can make a big difference to developers and companies and how they work. And we also know, because quite a lot of companies use our product, mm-hmm. that if we demonstrate something like right now, or for the last few years, actually, accessibility has been a really important initiative of ours, to make GitHub more accessible to as many people as possible, and to really sort of equalize the playing field for people with disabilities. If we build tooling that makes it easier for people to ship accessible code, or even just talk about how we do it and our practices, we're a big beacon of visibility there that can have an impact on the rest of the industry. So that's something that comes with great responsibility, I guess, but I really value that.
Cool. Well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. I hope you enjoy the rest of your config experience and the Leadership Collective. Let's give a round of applause.
Yes.
Thank you.